The ability to change our mental state should therefore be developed before it is urgently needed. Point 3. Minimize the chances of having emotions when such situations cannot be avoided. The next principle is minimize the chances of having negative emotional reactions when the situations themselves cannot be avoided. There are several ways of doing this. 3.1 Manage emotion-related input data streams. Modern life gives us an enormous amount of information. Our phones, computers, television, and social media platforms continuously provide information that can influence our emotions. Therefore, one important method is to manage the streams of information entering the mind. 3.1.1 Do not allow input mechanisms to generate streams of data that can match the relevant past experiences. We should be careful about allowing information into the mind that is likely to connect with previous experiences and generate emotional reactions. For example, if certain types of news, images, or conversations repeatedly bring back anger or fear, continuously exposing ourselves to the same material may strengthen the emotional response. This does not mean that we should remain ignorant of what is happening in the world. It means that we should learn to distinguish between necessary information and unnecessary emotional stimulation. Today, a person can receive dozens or even hundreds of notifications every day. Not every notification deserves an emotional response. 3.1.2 Skill related to modification of input mechanism to accommodate this property should be practiced in day-to-day life. We should therefore develop the skill of modifying the way information reaches us. We can control notifications. We can choose when to read messages. We can reduce unnecessary exposure to disturbing material. We can decide which information deserves our attention. These are practical skills that can be developed in everyday life. The objective is not to control the entire outside world. It is to develop greater control over what we allow to enter the mind and how frequently we expose ourselves to it. 3.2 Managing the reappearance of emotions while receiving the same type of information. Sometimes the same information cannot be avoided. We may repeatedly have to receive information that reminds us of something unpleasant. In such situations, the method is different. 3.2.1 Focus on the action of accepting the input data without changing the attention to understand the nature of data. Instead of immediately becoming involved with the emotional meaning of the information, we can focus on the simple action of receiving it. In other words, we can notice, I am receiving this information, rather than immediately allowing the mind to move into the old emotional story. For example, suppose someone makes a criticism that reminds us of a previous unpleasant experience. Instead of immediately thinking, this person is treating me unfairly again, we can first recognize that a piece of information has been received. This creates a small space between receiving the information and reacting emotionally to it. 3.2.2 Skill of focusing on actions should be practiced in daily life. This ability to focus on the action itself should be practiced in everyday life. When we repeatedly practice directing attention toward what we are actually doing, rather than automatically following every thought and emotional association, the skill becomes stronger. This is particularly useful in a world where attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. 3.3 Managing emotions created due to physical pain. Physical pain can also create emotional reactions. Pain itself is a physical experience, but the mind can add fear, frustration, anger, or anxiety to that experience. 3.3.1. Focus on the place of the body where pain is present rather than on the pain itself. The method described here is to focus on the place in the body where the pain is present rather than becoming absorbed in the pain itself. For example, instead of mentally repeating, "This pain is terrible. How long will it last? I cannot tolerate it." Attention can be directed more specifically toward the location of the physical sensation. There is an important difference between observing where the sensation is and becoming mentally absorbed in the unpleasantness of the sensation. This does not mean that necessary medical treatment should be ignored. Physical pain may require proper diagnosis and treatment. The point here is to manage the additional emotional reaction that can arise around the physical sensation.